So, hello, listeners. It is my pleasure to have John Sturino for today's podcast. John is SVP of Product and Engineering at MXGBT Agencia. He runs the ship at Agencia, and at the same time, if I have to describe him in 2 words, it would be kind and generous, which is why he immediately said yes to this podcast. A little bit about the company both of us work for. It is Agencia, and it's a leading corporate travel management program that helps companies streamline business travel arrangements, manage travel-related expenses, and comply with corporate travel policies. So, John, as an introduction, I just wanted to ask you, what was your path to product management and then SVP, and what are the qualities that made you an SVP today?
Sure. Thank you for having me, first off. Second, a slight amendment. And this will be important as I talk. The company is MXGBT. The product, one of the products we have, and the company does work on business travel. One of the products we have is Agencia, and and I bring that up because being a product manager in a multi-product company is a very different job than necessarily being a product manager in a startup or a single product company. So it's one of the things that I'm focused on with my team right now is sort of that challenge of hitting different parts of the product, different parts of the market with different products. So how did I get into product management? So I should explain that I'm about 500 years old. And so when I actually went to college, there was no such thing as product management. And so, product management was something that was used to mean like my product was cornflakes or something like that. It was very, very different job. And so I actually began my career completely separately. I did nonprofit work and wound up running different environmental and social nonprofits in the countries of the former Soviet Union. And one of those initiatives that I ran was helping nonprofits get connected to the internet. And so I would travel to all of the different parts of all of the different countries and help people get online. And I really realized the power and the value of the internet. And I know that sounds like a super weird thing to say, but this was a long time ago. And so I really wanted to get involved and to start working in it. And so I left all of that. I moved back to the US. And I got a job with the startup, basically as a sysadmin, and then as a developer. And I did that for a little while. And then I get a call from America Online. I told you I was 500 years old. And they were looking for product managers for international product management. And even though I hadn't ever done product management before, I got the job for 2 reasons. One is I'd had fairly good international experience at that point, even though it wasn't in any of the particular target markets, but finding people in Northern Virginia who even understood what other countries were was a bit of a stretch. And the other reason was I was cheap, right? I'd been working in nonprofits. I did not have high salary expectations. So that's how I got started. And just to give you a sense for how different things were, my first day, they gave me 2 blank documents. And one was 64 pages, and the other one was, I want to say, like 122 pages. And one was a business requirements document, and the other one was a product requirements document. And basically, it was just, these were, when I say blank, these were just the questions that you were supposed to ask. before doing any new product. Like this is what it took to even start up anything. And so so when I joined, my boss said, well, what product do you want to work on? And I was like, well, that's kind of a weird question. I would have thought that they would have hired me with an idea of which product they wanted me to work on, but that wasn't how it worked. They were just growing. So they were just hiring product managers, and then they were like letting them choose. And a colleague of mine said something interesting. He said, listen, if you go towards, he said you could do mail or messaging or any of these other things, but they're going to be very specific to this company. And if you do things like billing and registration and data, any company is going to need those. Now, I think he just didn't want to do them, so he was trying to push me over to that space. But it was also something in line with something a friend of mine had told me that his faculty advisor in college, who was Condoleezza Rice, had told him, which is if you want to stand out faster or move faster, choose an area that's important but isn't overcrowded. So we were having this discussion in the Republic of Georgia, and I was asking him how he wound up there, and she said, look, if you want to study Latin America, great, but you're going to be competing with everybody. You choose a country nobody knows a lot about, you'll move forward a lot faster. So between those two things, I said, okay, I'll go towards this thing that is necessary but not sexy. Which then led me to, obviously, like that, it led me to running that group quickly, because again, nobody wanted to do it, so I quickly became the expert. And then, as new opportunities came up, we signed a joint venture with a Chinese company, Lenovo, as it's now known. And then they offered me then they asked me whether I would go move to Beijing and help start that up, because getting paid and getting people to sign up were the hardest things to do in China. And then being in that smaller startup-y organization gave me a broader sense for all of the different pieces, which then I just started to apply more broadly. So I worked for AOL for a few years after China. I moved to the UK and worked in their European offices. And then I moved back to the States and I started working for Yahoo. And what was interesting for me was I was able to work at Yahoo pretty easily. So I was actually had started and was getting my MBA. And it wasn't that difficult because all of the problems were the same problems. You just sort of had to figure out how to make it work. And many were things that, I had dealt with years before in a different company. After a couple of years of that, I kept going to my manager and I kept saying, what's the hardest problem you have? Right? So in case this is sort of, this was, I would get good at a thing, I would get it under control, and then I would go to my boss and I'd say, what's the biggest problem you have? And when we sort of ran out of those, and the company was going through a lot of tumult, I said, well, okay, let me go work in a startup, right? I mean, there's the distance between knowing the right thing to do and being able to get it done in a big company is really aggravating sometimes. So let me go work in a startup. So then I went and I went to go work for Braintree, which then got sold to PayPal. I went to go work in a data startup, which was fine, but it really wasn't my cup of tea. And then I went to go work for this marketing technology startup, where the challenge was profitability. And again, the thing with the startups is fundamentally, as a product manager, you've got to be thinking, well, how do I solve the customer's problem? And I know we're going to get onto OKRs in a second, but fundamentally, when you're in a startup, you've got um, one real objective, which is to survive and to grow. And I had a moment where I was talking to the CEO, and he was like, "Why aren't we doing this?" And I don't even remember what it was exactly. And I said, "Well, because that's a short-term revenue option. This is a long-term revenue growth." And so if it was a crisis, sure, I would do that. And he says, "We're going to run out of money in 6 months, so it's kind of a crisis." And I was like, "Oh, well, that would have been a good piece of information to have." And so I went to the CFO the next morning because I was in Denmark at the time, and I said, "How bad is it?" He said, "You may want to buy your ticket home now." I said, "Okay." So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to now not pretend like we're not about to run out of money. We're going to say, what is it going to take for us to get profitable? Within 6 months, we actually were profitable, and the company has continued to be profitable and to grow since then. Right. So it was fundamentally focusing on what is the singular most important thing you've got to accomplish, and going after that with pure focus.
Yeah. Sounds great. I mean, basically, this is to summarize, I think you came from a little bit of unconventional background, which actually helped you, which is like, you did nonprofit, you did that, and your international, exposure helped you at the beginning, I guess, to become the product manager. And then I think you just grabbed you grabbed opportunities, like, by just asking for hardest problems. And like you said, the third thing is that whenever you saw a problem, you went after it with focus, right, to accomplish the results. So I think these three things I can see as maybe the critical qualities maybe that have made you see an SVP today. So I am very impressed, of course, by the
Can I?
background.
Well, I wouldn't be impressed. But what I would say is, let me expound on the first point, because I do think it is important, that fundamentally, bringing your whole self to your job is important, right? And that all of your experience is what makes you you. And what I got from my nonprofit days was not just the international experience, of course, but I had learned how to manage budgets and manage people, and to focus on clarity of outcomes, and how to work, basically how to work. So I came into my first product management job later than if I had just come out of college, but more as a whole person, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
having existed on a shoestring and been able to manage all of those things, it was, I know, the challenges were a lot less difficult than I think I would have thought if that was, if I had just come into it directly out of
Yeah,
college.
directly. Yeah, last point before we go into the next topic, which is the main focus. It's like sometimes I feel sorry for myself that I have too conventional, a background like master's in computer science, developer, and then product manager, without, all of these adventures, in the middle. So sometimes I feel like maybe I should have done more of that, but that's fine. Yeah, I can still do it. So maybe I
You
can get
can
started now.
still do it, but what I would say is, it's I will say this. I gotten asked a lot of times over the years, who makes better product managers, engineers or non-engineers? And I have always said that that's the wrong question, right? That I've had great product managers who had no engineering background. I've had great product managers who were great engineers. The difference to me is actually a human difference. It's what is your capability for empathy? And I know we use empathy a lot these days. As I say, 500 years old. When people started asking me this question, empathy wasn't used as much as it is now. But because I think when a word becomes used, it loses a meaning a little bit. But fundamentally, empathy is the ability to um, understand what another person is going through without having to be that other person. And especially in B2B SaaS, it's super important that you are able to uh, fully recognize what a person who has a job that you will never have has to do, is it cares about in order to do their job well, to figure out what the right product that they need is.
Yeah.
So, so a lot of times, so you'll see even within our organization, people drift towards the traveler problem because they can empathize with that better because we're all travelers. We've all been on business trips.
Yeah.
So we can understand what that's like. But being somebody who has to manage people who are traveling, right? I was talking to a travel manager. Yeah, I was talking to a travel manager. And by the way, the best way to get empathy in life and in work is to talk to people who have that, who have that lived experience. And so, I was talking to one of them, and they were talking about how before sending women to the Middle East, that they have to give them a whole set of guidelines about these are things that you have to consider before, right? That you have to do when they're, not something that I had even thought of, like as somebody's job to make sure somebody else was sort of was prepared for that, because and a lot of the travel managers I talk to feel very personally responsible for the well-being of the people who are traveling.
Yeah. So I guess I will add another quality, basically customer empathy. So that's what you would say makes a good product manager. Okay, so we can move on to the next topic. Since I have John here, I want to pick his brain on OKRs. And for people who have not heard it, which I cannot imagine, OKR stands for Objectives and Key Results. And they are effective goal setting and leadership tool for communicating what you want to accomplish and what milestones you will need to meet in order to accomplish them. So I want to definitely focus on OKRs because, it is a concept that has been I have been very curious about the process of OKRs because it's kind of the center of the organization, right? It is deciding what all the product managers are doing for the rest of the year. So that's why I've been always curious. And today I will use this chance to ask you the questions. So the first thing is when you set the OKRs, who are all of the stakeholders and who are all sitting at the table deciding the OKRs?
So I'm going to give a trigger warning first, right? Which is OKRs have a very distinct meaning, and there's a very there's a science behind them. I've never studied the official way of doing OKRs, so I may say something that somebody who is a real expert would be like, that's not right. I'm more of a there's a great book by Ben Horowitz called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And the whole point of it is to say, if there's a formula out there that works, then everybody would do it. And that's not how you become a great company, right? You've got to figure out what works for you. So when I talk about OKRs, I'm going to talk about how we do OKRs. I'm not going to talk about how OKRs were originally configured or how Google does them or anything like that. Obviously, I've read up about them. I understand those things. So it is slightly different, but some people can get very protective of some of these things. And I just want to put it out there. So your question is, who decides on the OKRs? The good news is that, well, let me talk about the theory and then let me talk about the practicalities. So in theory, there's a company vision, then there's a company mission, then there's a company strategy, and then from that derives a product vision and a product strategy, and from that derives your objectives, and from that derives your key results. Right? That's sort of the in principle. And in reality, yes, all of those things do exist. The problem with all of those is the things that are unsaid in in all of that work, right? So your mission and your vision will not say keep all of your existing customers happy, right? They will think they say it by saying grow, right? But they sort of, unless you know, it is not necessarily intuitive to everybody that the only way you grow is by adding more people than are leaving, which means you need to have as much care about how your existing customers feel about your product as the people who you're trying to bring in. I had a very good lesson on this, which I couldn't put into words for years, but there was a guy who was running acquisition for AOL, and I find myself talking about it a lot these days. I don't know why. But there was a guy who was running acquisition for AOL, and he said, the first time they hear welcome, I don't care about them anymore, right? So the first time they actually connect, the acquisition guy's like, my job is done. And I thought, that doesn't sound right. Like, that just seems like, wait a second. And then I went and started looking at the numbers, and I realized, oh my God, we were acquiring people like crazy. And that was the vanity metric that we would talk about. But we were churning customers crazy at a crazy level too. And so, you know, you've got to balance your basics to say, my objectives, if my objective is this, you now have to start to talk about what does that mean, right? So as I just said, right, if our objective is to grow, then that means that my retention number needs to be here as well as my acquisition number needs to be here. So then what are the things, so then you wind up prioritizing the things that help both of those targets. I hope you're going to edit this. So that's why I'm giving you very long answers. Great.
Yeah.
So the answer to your actual question is, we generate a set of recommended objectives with some key results underneath them as sort of a starting point. Because going to a group of people and saying, what are our objectives, is a nightmare. And so, and the reality is everybody sort of knows what they are already. So getting to alignment is pretty easy. Now, the trickier part is in a multi-product company, right? So now setting your objectives for GBT as opposed to for Egencia, the challenge is, how do you set objectives that are meaningful to everybody, but not so abstract that they don't translate into anything, right? Because in the end, if your objectives are make more money, right? You know, your objective is to make more money. Great, but how does that help me to make a decision? Right? Because the purpose of the OKRs is to empower everybody in the organization. Right? The point of it is to say, hey, everybody, go this way, and then let them run. Right? And so without that, you could have people working at cross purposes. And even with that, you still have people not necessarily working at cross purposes, but you have challenges sometimes, right? In the end, you know, the thing I find myself explaining over and over and over is the purpose of prioritization isn't to not to do the two things. It's, if you can't do both things, which one should you choose? Right. So for me, I like to even have my objectives in priority order, because sometimes it's the same people trying to achieve more than one objective. Now that, by the way, is where I have challenges in reality of getting company alignment, because different leaders within the company have different objectives that they are metriced on. And so getting the head of customer success to say, yeah, it's okay that reducing call volumes is not a priority is a hard thing.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Having the conversation that says driving revenue growth is more important than bringing this down is still a hard conversation. So I sort of do a psychological trick around this, which is because I can't get CEO level agreement to prioritize the objectives, I list them out left to right, as most people read, in the order that I believe that they're important, so that people sort of internalize this one
Automatically.
is more important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very
Uh,
nice.
um, because it really does. It comes back down to, why do you want to do this exercise, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And good.
Yeah, no, that's great actually. I think it is, maybe what I can say is that you have the theory of all the theory around what is a textbook version of OKRs, and then you combine it with your own your own way of doing things, I guess, while setting the OKRs. And then probably at the time of alignment, you're also psychologically, like, because you're having tough conversations, so you have to kind of also employ some kind of a psychological way of handling those difficult conversations. Probably, would that
Well,
summarize what you were saying?
yeah. Well, what I would say is, okay, so who do I have to get aligned? First thing you have to do on the objectives is you have to get the executive team aligned. Right. So I have to get the agency executive team and the GBT executive team aligned to say, yes, we agree that these are the priorities. Then really what you get into is the key results, is where a lot of the negotiation happens. So if you're not prioritizing your objectives, then it's not hard to really get everybody aligned on the objectives, because they are kind of, again, they're broad enough to cover the whole company. So then it's the actual prioritization of the objectives for the teams. I don't make it explicit, I make it implicit. And then you focus in on the KPIs. And I fundamentally, what I would say is, this really is the hardest part of the job, because choosing between a good idea and a bad idea is really easy, right? Prioritizing, let's do, let's buy a car versus let's blow our money in Vegas. They're kind of not equivalent decisions. But choosing between two good ideas is actually the job, right? That is fundamentally what our job is. So how do we drive people to choose between good decisions?
Yeah.
In which case, you've got to go back and say, okay, well, would you rather have this or this? And so now we get to, if your objective is this, then what are your key performance indicators? Or sorry, what are your key results?
Yeah.
Now, for key results, I'm a strong believer in what they call countervailing metrics. This is to say, you can achieve a result in a bad way. So how could achieving this result go wrong? And then what secondary metric do you put in place to make sure that that's not happening? Because the Mark Hollyhead, who's my boss, he has an expression which is, beware of the man with the single KPI.
Oh, interesting.
So if you were focused on just this one thing, you will let everything else burn to make that happen.
Yeah.
And so, right, so when we think about our key results, the result has to be how do we make sure that that result is a net positive? And it's a conversation I have around the company all the time, right? When
Yeah.
people are like, hey, I want to do this. Okay, well, let me make sure that it's net positive before we decide that we're going to go forward with it, right? So first they start with, well, why do you want to do this? Well, we want to do this because we think we can make this amount of revenue. Okay. Okay, let's say we can make that amount of revenue, but if you make $3 million in revenue and you spend $5 million in costs, is that really the thing that you want to do?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if you make $3 million in revenue, but what you're actually doing on the supply side, but you're driving away customers, is that really what we want to do? So these are this is the countervailing metric that I always look for.
Okay, yeah, that's actually my next question is what are the factors that, you consider while setting the OKRs? So you kind of covered, some of the factors that you take, right? So in fact, I have to say that the OKRs you set for Agencia is probably the first time I have personally been able to identify with while I'm setting my individual, individual OKRs, because there were companies, not naming companies, but where I copy pasted the objectives coming from above saying that I will make sales of some $1 million or something like that, which had no meaning to me. But I was just copying because I didn't know what else to do. So, but definitely in agency, I think I really, appreciate the identifiability of the OKRs.
So the trick with the OKRs is exactly what you're talking about, which is you've got to make them specific enough so that everybody can see themselves in them, but not so specific that you're essentially telling the team what to go do.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Because if you get to the point where, and by the way, I the first version we did of this, there was a lot of projects in it, right? And we had to sort of keep pulling it back and scaling it back and say, no. I know, yes, we know we're going to do that, but we have to keep pulling back and explaining to people why they go do that, why they're doing that, because otherwise, if their goal is to release a thing that's called this, then the impact that thing has was never the goal that we set for the team. And if they're just doing it because we've told them to go do it, you're not going to get the best version of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm, so the making sure you allow for team level creativity and team level empowerment and drive, that's really, really important. Now,
yeah.
One of the areas that is really hard and we can improve on, and I think most companies can improve on, well, all companies I've been a part of, is the actual follow-up. Right? We've got to get to a mindset where releasing is a milestone. It's not an achievement. Right? My achievement is the outcome that drove me to do it in the first place. Now, sometimes releasing is the achievement if it's, a technical thing or we're shutting it down or whatever. But even shutting things down, we had this tech debt conversation around our data strategy. And they were like, oh, we'll be able to pay off all this tech debt. And I said, okay, exactly how? Like, tell me the benefit. And when we got into it, it was like, well, here's the benefit. I said, okay, so does our plan actually include all of that work? No. Okay, well, why not? Like, because everybody's just like, oh, well, we'll get it. Like, well, not unless you actually plan to go get it. So you have to be very specific about what you're trying to achieve for people to make the plans to go and achieve those things. Otherwise, they just do the part that you've been clear is important. And again, the more specific you are, I think the worse results you get. Yeah.
That's great. Actually, I'm a big fan of shutting down things. Please give me a chance to shut down something. I have never had the pleasure of shutting down. So I was,
Well, that is why I like to do. We have the jazz funeral, so I do like to celebrate when we do shut things down.
shut things down. Yeah.
But when we do that again, it's the I don't necessarily worry too much to say, okay, well, we reduced the amount of landscape that we're covering, therefore our velocity should have improved by 12%, and therefore our KELO should have dropped by 4%. I'm not that concerned with dropping with measuring at that level, like that there's a certain point in which you spend more to measure than the value you get in the work.
Yeah.
It's more of the, hey guys, yes, you feel great about shutting this down, but since you didn't also shut this other thing down, you have the same amount of work. You just moved it from here to here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So there is a function of saying, why are we shutting this down? Right. Are we really getting the value out of shutting this down? Is that where our pain point is, or is the pain point this and this together, and therefore it all needs to be solved for before we see any benefit out of doing it, rather than the momentary, sugar rush of, hey, we got to shut this thing down.
Shut this down. Yeah. Yeah. So there is no magic happening after shutting down. You just need to focus more on other things that are more useful, I guess. Yeah.
That is the value of that. Well, the problem, and can I go on a rant about tech debt for a second?
Yeah, you can.
So let me tie it to objectives, and then I'll talk about the challenge with it. So, objectively speaking, it is very hard to manage tech debt in your OKRs. And the reason for that is that the pain is diffuse, meaning it's like a slow leak in the tire, and whereas the benefit is acute of building something new. And so there's so if you, and part one. Part two is you also generally attack major architectural investments by going after the biggest use case first, which usually means you wind up having all of the small stuff left over at the end, which then becomes really hard to prioritize because the benefits of doing that are each individual piece are going to be small. So, we have a separate conversation around objectives around the architecture and objectives around KTLO, and that we utilize as a way of saying, and we've set up these KPIs that are that are predictive of customer pain, that will also tell us when we've got problems in our architecture, right? So payment success rate as an example, right? And if that drops, you have a whole bunch of complaining customers. So rather than wait for the customers to complain to find out there's a problem, we have it as a metric. It's got to stay at this metric. Now, often the way to deal with these things is to make sure your architecture is constantly updated so that you're best, so that those things are kept up. The other thing is to say, if the amount of time you're doing on non-productive, non-enhancement work, I don't want to say non-productive, non-enhancement work. So your KTLO proportion of your total volume, of your total bandwidth, is too high. Now, we have arguments what that should be. 15%, 20%, 25%, whatever that number it should be is, as an objective to get to. Well, the only way to really get there is by dealing with the tech debt that you have laying around. So rather than try and get there through major investments or through promising revenue or servicing improvements around it, we basically say, look, we work off of a fixed model. We have X amount of capacity. If you want to make more of that, so one way to improve the amount of effective bandwidth you have, rather than hiring more people, is to reduce the amount of acreage that they have to cover. So you use KTLO as a proxy to say, a 5% reduction in KTLO is incremental, is the same as hiring 75 new people, right? And therefore your cost value of that is this.
Yeah.
So it's a different way to get there, because one of the big challenges you always have is the amount of empathy or clarity that the executive team even has for what it is, right? What it takes to build, what it takes to maintain, how software development actually works. People they both want innovation and they want clarity, and those two things don't go together, right? There's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of swipes at the apple, but we also have, a forecast, and we have models that we have to put out, and we have projections to the street, and we have all of these things. So everybody's being reasonable, and so you have to find a way through those different needs of different parts of the company.
Yeah. Okay, so that kind of, actually, you mentioned it. My next question is the balance between KTLO and aspirational OKRs. Just in case the listeners don't know what KTLO, it means that keep the lights on, which is like maintaining what exists. So how do you balance that when you are setting the OKRs?
So the first thing that so I went into a little bit, which is to say, you have to make everybody aware of what it is, right? So when you're dealing with, because KTLO is fundamentally my problem to solve. So my boss, his boss, the CFO, they don't understand it and they don't really care about it, right? And first, you've got to create a level of understanding for why software doesn't just run. Right? I mean, it sounds kind of, it sounds kind of strange, but to a person who hasn't had to do this job, the idea that the fact that you can't just build something and it just runs doesn't make a ton of sense. Right? So you have to actually start to explain that things don't exist in isolation. We are constantly interacting with all different parts of our own ecosystem, which are constantly changing, but we're also, even if we froze all development on our own ecosystem, things would still break because we have to keep up with the adjacent ecosystems with which we interact. Right? We interact with the airline companies, and if they change their APIs, things just break if we don't do something about it. So just getting the sense that a portion of your investment towards having a product is to make sure the product works, right? And it's kind of an odd thing to say, but you have to get that concept across. Now, when you get to the point where it's 50-75% of your capacity is on KTLO, something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
Then you're not a software company, you're a project company. You created a project and you abandoned it. Now you're just doing what you can to keep it alive. So somewhere between 0 and 50% is the right number. And that right number is going to be different, I think, for different software types in different companies, even within our own company, different teams,
Yeah.
right? And from time to time, if a part of what you're building is more important than another part, you may allow KTLO to drift up for a period of time in a certain part of the organization while you're focused over here on trying to address this need. So how do I deal with them in OKRs is the first thing I do is, so the first thing I did was I created an objective called keep your promises.
Yeah.
Right? So what you've got to do is you've got to get it out of the defensive black box arena that keep the lights on sounds like. It's like, it can be expressed to non-technical parts of the organization as, don't you worry about it. You got to just trust me. I need to spend all this money to keep things running. You wouldn't understand, right? And so by reframing that as, look, people signed a contract with us. Our core job is that they get what they paid for. Going back to my point about retention as well as growth, right? Retention is growth. So making them happy, making them ultimately, what you really want to do is make them advocates, right? A large portion of our wins come from a travel manager leaving one company and going to a different company and then saying, I really liked Egencia. Can we have them? So they've got to have a really good experience, which comes back to, does it work when you need it in the way you expected it to work? So that's relatively, I think, straightforward. Now that's part one. Then part two is the much more nuanced and harder one, which is what I call experience bugs. So what they used to call works as designed, right?
Yeah.
And WAD is the worst acronym of all time. But works as designed, basically the only reason you would have to say that is if it doesn't work as expected, right? And so those are harder because you make a decision at some point to not cover a specific use case, and then you've got to decide at another point whether that was the right decision or whether that is still the right decision with the information you have now. And so what you've got is keeping your promises, which everybody understands, which is to say the product's got to work. Then you come to, does it work the way people expect it to work? So if I was to take it through sort of the three phases is, does it work? Does it perform? So does it work the way we expect it to? And does it delight? Right? And the delight part is where you spend a lot of your product time and your UX time is, can I have it do more than you thought it was capable of doing? Right? And that's really what you strive for in your product work. But you can't get to delight if you don't fulfill those other two phases.
In terms of aspirational OKRs, so how do you go about, like, I know that you, let's say, have convinced everyone that this KTLO has to be somewhere between 0-50, all of that is done. How do you, do the aspirational OKR part? Like, do you go by the market trend or, other companies, like competitive research?
So it's not a single thing. So yes, we are constantly looking at competitors. Now, the most important thing that I've learned about competitors is that just because they do a thing doesn't mean that thing works. Doesn't mean anybody wants it or anybody uses it. So you have to be careful not to fall into the following trap. You look at competitors, you talk to customers, right? There's three ways that you can talk to them. Right? One is they do survey responses. So you actually we have a lot of data and a lot of verbatims from customers about what they like and what they don't like. The second way is you talk to them through what they do, because what somebody says and what somebody does are often very different. And what somebody does is a much truer reflection of what they want versus what they say. And then that's by looking at the data, which is why making sure that when you're building a product, you are measuring what it is you need to understand. Fundamentally, you want to be able to track all of the data that will allow you to reconstruct their experience in its entirety. And then you got to be looking at the data all the time, right? What is the data telling me? Then you've got to look at two other things. One is what's happening with the technology, right? And the technology is important on two fronts, because it is both what's possible, but also resetting the frame with the customers as to what they should expect to be possible, which relates to the last one, which is you got to look at other products, other industries. Right? What are people, and again, that has two things, which is how are people solving related problems in different industries, but
Yeah, yeah.
also how are customers' expectations being set about how things work. So as we haven't, I don't think, quite hit the tipping point yet, but it is very close, in which the expected a response to a query is going to be an answer, and not a direction to go to a place to go find an answer. And so so you're sort of saying, okay, but what does that have to do with us? Well, think about how our help center works. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not asking you an abstract question about a thing. I'm asking you a question like, how do I get a refund? Or is this ticket refundable?
Yeah.
My expectation, because of AI, is you should be able to answer that question in a chat in full English, right? Not send me to an article to tell me where I can go to find out, or what I should look at in the UI to tell me that it is doing that.
Yeah.
And, if we're not there in the next, I'd say 18 months, our UX is going to be behind again. So it is, what are the needs of the business, right? Where are our strengths and weaknesses? What are we seeing? What are our customers telling us? By the way, the win-loss is a really important conversation that we have as well, right? So because people are voting with their feet, if they feel strongly enough to change, then one way or the other, towards us or away from us, then those are the things that are really important to them.
Yeah.
Right? We gotta look at the data, we gotta look at the trends, and then we gotta look at what's possible and how are we making what's possible what's real.
Okay. So that makes sense. So that's great information, John, on OKRs. I think I have another probably 10 questions, but I think we should, in the interest of time, proceed to the last question, which is, what is your advice for the experience? Actually, because you are here today, instead of asking about the aspiring product managers, I want to ask about people who are in like that mid-level, and aspiring to be in senior leadership positions. Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah. What I would say is, I guess, a few things, and hopefully you can edit this to make it make more sense than the way it's going to come out of my mouth.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the first thing is at that mid-level point, you are at the peak of where influence without authority is important, right? Your ability to get people to move and to align with you without managing them directly is at its peak value, right? Because the higher you go, the more people who report to you and the more sort of institutional power you have to get people to align with you, the less sort of personal power you need to apply, soft power, right, to get people to line up with you. Now is sort of, focusing on that. By the way, it's always useful. So being good at it now doesn't mean you don't have to use it later. You just have to use it in different ways later. But it's always a super valuable trait. And it really sucks hearing it from your boss, which is to say, oh, well, you should be able to get that done anyway. I'm like, well, yeah, but it would be a lot easier if they just reported to me. Yeah, well, that's not always the case, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got to focus in on how do I line things up. And the second thing I would say is take advantage of all of the opportunities that you do have, right? That where are your opportunities to get to know people outside of your team, get to create your name outside of even P&T, right? Not even just your own feature team, but the organization as a whole. Getting those insights about what matters to other people and being able to help them out, and giving them insights as to how they can be more effective, super valuable. But also, like, if you are presenting at the monthly product review, or if you want to present at the monthly product review, like, make sure you are focused on that being a really good, that you doing a really good job, right? It is your, and ask your manager, hey, what would it take for me to make this a really good presentation? Or, hey, would you mind listening to my presentation, giving me some feedback before I go out? Like, when the first couple of NPRs I did, I would actually have all of the product managers who were present to me ahead of time, and then I would give them advice and, well, say it this way, don't say it this way, focus over here, right? That sort of thing. And so asking for that help is definitely a thing. And making sure you are constantly aware of what's important, and you're framing everything you're doing in terms of what is important in the company right now. The more you are visibly connecting those dots, because a lot of times, I will probably spend an hour or two after the NPR talking to Mark and Paul and explaining to them why we're doing certain things. Because while they may line up at an objectives level, they're not always, the connection isn't always necessarily clear, right? This thing that I'm doing, I know what's important to us right now is growing volume. In order for us to grow volume, we can increase the amount of volume we get by making it faster to onboard new customers. And therefore, the work that we're doing will help to increase volume in the following ways, right? Or I know that retention is a top goal to us, and I know that a top detractor score is driven from, or a top win-loss reason is this this dual platforms, the different experience between Europe and the US. And therefore, what we're doing to address that issue is this, and therefore the impact we expect that to have is this. So having that sort of higher level view of really understanding why you're doing what you're doing, and making it easier for everybody else to understand how they can help you make that successful, it elevates you as a person who isn't isn't somebody who simply does what they're told to do. It's somebody who understands and drives towards the most important outcomes.
Yeah. So actually, one of the things I was thinking the other day, just ruminating on my experience. So I was just thinking that, as PMs, you should be like constantly like pitching. Pitching doesn't mean that it has to be a new idea, like a company, another company or something. You should just be pitching ideas within, it can be an idea, it can be a presentation about something you have done, which is what we do in MPR. So it's like a constant state of like pitching. I feel like if they do that, then maybe one of the things like maybe will catch on and things like that. So I feel that is one way.
I think that's definitely true, but let me come back to one point, which I think is probably also the most important with all of this, which is to say, doing the follow-up that says, so we're really good at generating ideas and things to be done and getting them done and getting them done. But then we're not really good at saying, hey, 3 months later, right, we launched this thing. Here's what happened, right? Here's the impact that it had on the business. Right. So let's say I'm doing this approvals, this cross-border approvals. Okay. We expected it to do what, and it did what, right? What did it do? Did it have any impact on our TMNPS? What does the usage of it look like, right? Have we, there was something that says we expect the approval time to approval will reduce by this. Did that actually play out over large numbers? So that sort of level of accountability that says this is my thing and I'm focused on delivering the results and not just the thing, I think is also a huge, like, that's the next level up, right?
Yeah.
Of the leaders that say, I'm holding myself and my team accountable for the outcomes, not just the actions. So definitely, hey, here's a better way for us to accomplish this goal than the way we're going at it right now. And here's why I think that. Should always be doing that. But also to say, hey, I got your backing for this thing that I did. Now I'm going to show you what you got for that backing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you actions and then have to be followed by results. So I think that completely makes sense. Yeah. So that was the last question. This was very, very informational and a memorable experience for me to sit with you to talk one-on-one. And you are also an inspiration for me. So all of this together makes it a very great experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. And look, it's not magic. That this is the thing I would ask you to sort of reflect in everybody is, it is not magic. Just focus on being valuable.
Yeah.
And then that's all it is if you're, and what I would say primarily is focus on being valuable to the customer, and everything else will flow from there.